Bay Area Psychology. Tonight, we have the opportunity to learn about the role of spiritual counseling in a time when psychiatry is dominated by science. When new medications and new genetic markers are discovered almost daily, what does the spiritual realm have to offer people who are suffering? After all, in this decade of the brain, Western medicine has severed the brain from the soul, and so it could seem old-fashioned, even quaint, to turn to a minister for counsel. Yet, authors such as Thomas More, Marianne Williams, Deepak Chopra, and James Redfield have drawn a strong following, indicating a grassroots desire for spiritual connection, despite these medical breakthroughs. How does spiritual counseling differ from traditional counseling? Well, I'm delighted that Reverend Hughes and Reverend Bovani Gerard were willing to make the trip down from the peninsula from the Golden Gate Interfaith Seminary in Berkeley. I felt it was especially significant to seek an interfaith perspective for an inclusive view on spiritual counseling that would transcend the particulars of various faith traditions. I want to welcome you both and appreciate you being willing to make the journey down tonight to talk to us about what spiritual counseling does have to offer and how it's different than traditional mental health counseling. I guess I would wonder, as I said in the monologue initially, how often people at this point in time, you know, when you look at the 90s, in your experience, has there been a shift in people seeking spiritual counseling, or more people coming, less people coming? What's your sense of that?
I have always been involved with people coming to me for spiritual counseling since I've been a minister. So it's always been that way. There has always been a place for clinical counseling, which I will refer to as separate from spiritual counseling. But I see that more for a crisis situation, when something has really come to a head and a person really needs some help in the moment. But then there's always the bigger picture behind that as to what is this person's life all about? What set of circumstances led them to this crisis? And often a spiritual counselor can give them more opportunity to explore that particular question and perhaps find some answers for themselves.
Do you think there's something going on culturally maybe? Because, you know, I mentioned these different authors that could be creating more awareness of that need. I mean, is that your experience?
Yes, I think there's more of an awareness. I think the boomer generation especially has integrated so many different traditions and beliefs that they realize that they're in some way questioning all beliefs and all traditions and looking for ways to integrate that, and finding that ministers, rabbis, priests have been counseling people for thousands of years just very finely. And
well, that was something I was talking about with my hairstylist before the show, actually. We were talking about the fact that the original psychotherapists were priests and shamans, and I mean, that's the foundation, were people that were very connected to both the spiritual and psychological realm.
Well, you know, there's been a more modern day separation of the two, but in years gone by, the recognition that we are spiritual beings as well as physical and mental and emotional beings was very well recognized. And people understood that in order to get through whatever problems had come to them, they really needed to take the spiritual realm into consideration to make any progress with it.
Do you think that people often come to spiritual counseling after they've tried other approaches?
Only again recently, I think. You see, I think in the past people went to the shaman or their priest maybe first.
Okay.
And only now, maybe in the last 25 or 30 years, would you agree with that? They think, oh, I have to go to my analyst or my therapist or my encounter group to solve this problem. So it's a kind of a recent thing, but I think it's kind of leveled off, and people are now remembering, oh, we need to get to that spiritual counselor as well, and draw the best from all of these disciplines and see what they can put together for themselves for their best improvement of their circumstances.
Actually, I'm finding that more in my practice, which is people who are seeing me for counseling, but who also meet with their pastor. And that can be both good, and it can also be difficult, depending on philosophically where their pastor is coming from versus, you know, sometimes I've had pastors work very well with me in terms of we're very clear in terms of how we're basically the division, who's going to do what, and kind of aligned. And then I've also had experiences where pastors encourage their clients to leave counseling. So I think there is still, even within the disciplines themselves, some difficulty knowing what each role is, whose role is what.
I think there needs to be a more holistic approach on behalf of the practitioners instead of that sort of competitive, my training is better than that one, and sort of maybe even refer the person to the specific area that would be best for them, to take the client in consideration and find out which would be the best method that they might employ instead of this sort of competition that we've always had. And so
well, I think part of it is that I know in my traditional training, I mean, we were taught that at some level, religious affiliation or strong spiritual belief was magical thinking, that it, in some ways, always needed to be referred because we just don't deal with that. And the longer I've been in practice, the more impossible I find not to deal with that because, it's sort of like there's a whole chunk of the person then that you have to sort of cut off and put over here as though it doesn't exist, and yet it always pops up. That desire for meaning, that desire to make sense of things. It doesn't go neatly in a package somewhere, I found, where I can just put it over here and let their pastor deal with it.
It also makes a difference, I think, if the pastor is very dogmatic as to opposed to whether or not they are or not. Because if they're dogmatic, they have an agenda that they want to present to people, and they want that person to fit into that box. And it would be very hard for you as the other counselor to coordinate with that. But if you were able to work with a spiritual counselor who had a more holistic approach, a more interfaith approach perhaps, which didn't center in on the dogma of any one particular faith tradition, perhaps the partnership would work better.
Yeah. Well, now that you bring that up, maybe you could clarify for our viewers exactly what interfaith means. This is, I know, a new tradition. There are, less than 200 interfaith ministers here in the United States. So this is not something probably everybody's familiar with. So why don't you tell us, what is interfaith?
Well, there's no one correct answer to that question, actually. There are probably more than 1,000 interfaith ministers now throughout the country, and everyone employs their own particular disciplines. Interfaith is really a combination of whatever the individual happens to combine, with an understanding that all faith traditions are leading to the same aspect. So there's spirituality and religion are two different vehicles, and religion is the vehicle to express one's spirituality. So how that unfolds individually is very different for each person.
Okay, so there's sort of an awareness of the various different paths to God are all valuable. All
Right.
have something to teach, all have something to draw from. Is there anything you want to add to that?
No, it was well said.
Okay.
Just that the recognition that all paths do lead to the same goal is very helpful, and it really takes the pressure off people, because otherwise they might tend to feel like, well, there must be one path that's the right one, and if I'm not following that one, I must be doing something wrong. And instead, that overall acknowledgement that says all paths that are practiced with sincerity and discipline and just great desire to grow is going to be very fruitful, and the goal will be reached. It's just a matter of time.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. In some ways, it strikes me that it's almost impossible to do wrong.
Exactly.
to do your faith wrong from the interfaith perspective.
That's
Okay.
right.
Let's take a look at some specific ways that perhaps spiritual counseling can be of assistance to people. Let's see. To help deal with feelings of guilt, anger, and despair when facing a loss. Help explore the question, why is this happening to me? Or help find new or renewed meaning in life. And I have those in front of me. Let's take the first one. In terms of dealing with feelings of guilt and anger and despair, I imagine the loss issue must be something very commonly dealt with in spiritual counseling.
Loss of
Family,
family.
friends, job, identity, loss.
I think grief counseling is a very big part of pastoral counseling. It unfolds in many different ways depending on the individual minister or counselor. Quite often it's to be there with someone and be there and listen. Spiritual counseling involves listening quite a bit. often people will be in a time of crisis, in a time of loss, and you can be there and be with them and just listen for them, and then, you know, several months later, "Boy, what you said that day was just great." And you think, "I didn't say anything," you know. It's just to be there essentially as the representative of the higher self or of God or whomever that person might look at it, that vehicle being.
Which I'm sure can be of great comfort to people.
I think it helps to be that center of calm strength in times like that. Not only, again, for the crisis of the moment, but hopefully just by that example to help people to realize that if they can develop that strong, calm center in themselves, they can get through times of loss and grief much, much better.
Okay, well that makes a lot of sense. I know we have done shows on grief, and we've done other shows on sort of coping with job change and loss, and it's something that's, I think, very crucial. It's unavoidable. It's one of those things, like taxes, I mean, you cannot get away from. Sooner or later, we will all have a loss.
And that's the thing. Since it's going to happen anyway, how best to get through these things?
Yeah.
Spiritual counselor can, number one, set an example, and then number two, guide others to be able to do the same thing.
Yeah. You know, it strikes me, as you were talking, that in some ways the issues we're talking about are what makes them different maybe is that they're universal, that perhaps, as a clinical counselor, what I'm doing is very specific. What specifically troubles you? And, you know, we look at alternatives and that sort of thing, but these things like loss and change and identity, I mean, these are very large, sort of universal, archetypical, in some ways, issues.
I think that's also something that makes the clinical approach and the spiritual approach different, in that the clinical approach often concentrates on the specifics of the problem. It becomes problem-oriented,
Yes, it does.
problem-conscious. Whereas spiritual counseling steps back, looks at the bigger picture, as you say, and looks at solution consciousness. How can we change our way of looking at something? How can we change ourselves so that that particular problem isn't so overbearing anymore,
sort
isn't
of
such
be
a
able
burden?
to see it in perspective.
Exactly.
We're going to take a quick break. Stay with us. When we return, we'll explore further areas in which spiritual counseling can prove helpful. Welcome back. You know, the next point that we had looked at in our graphics was the question, why is this happening to me? And it strikes me that in my specialty, which tends to be working with addiction and recovery, this is a very often asked question, which is, you know, if there even is a God, how could a God allow this to happen? You know, how come we have misery in the world? How come we have starving people? I mean, that's sort of wanting to hold God accountable. And I want an explanation. Somebody has to answer for this.